The reason that I'm recording this session is because there may be people who came to the first class and couldn't come to this one. I'll be trying to record most of the classes that I do so that you guys can review them later. All right, so what is salvation history? This is a painting. You guys probably recognize it from, it's by Michelangelo. It's in the Sistine Chapel. And it's the moment when Adam is created by God. And we talk about salvation history because the whole history of the Jewish people, and then now us, the Catholic people, the people of the New Covenant, is the story of how sinners are saved by God. So we'll talk about angels. We'll talk about Adam and Eve, and we're also going to talk today about why there is suffering in the world. That is a huge question, and anyone ever have an argument with an atheist? And thing they keep coming back to is, I can't believe in God, because if there's God, there wouldn't be so much terrible things going on in the world. Anyone ever have that conversation? So you can see it's a really important thing to talk about today, and we're going to get to that. All right, so let's talk first about creation, angels, and the Old Testament. So we're going to go to the beginning now. And even before Adam and Eve, even before, God created the angels. Now, whenever you see the letter CCC in this class, it stands for Catechism of the Catholic Church. Catechism of the Catholic Church. The two main books that this class is based on are the Bible and the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Now, I put this link up here for a reason. By the way, it's really important to take notes. Think of it this way, guys. If you were in boot camp in the Marines and the drill sergeant tells you some instructions, right? Maybe you take notes, maybe you don't, but you dang well better remember those instructions. You know what I'm saying? Okay, well, look, if what we're training here for is a battle that's more important than what the Marines are training for, then we need to show how much it matters to us by taking notes. Of course, I am going to record stuff. That's going to help you out. He's listening actively. So I put this here because what you can do is you can get the catechism online from your phones, from your computers, by just using that link. If that's a little too long for you, no problem. Just write Vatican.va. And once you're there, you can go to the catechism, and you can even go to everything that any pope has ever written in the whole history of the entire church. It's a pretty amazing site. All right, so here's what the catechism says about angels. With their whole beings, the angels are servants and messengers of God. Messengers. In Greek, the word angelos means messenger. And angelos is where we get our English word angel, or the Spanish word ángel. It comes from the Greek. And that's the main role of the angels, right? They are servants and messengers. They do God's bidding. God gives them commands, and they gladly carry those out. That is the joy of their existence. Now, angels are distinguished from each other only by their levels of perfection. So what this means is the angels, they're hard for us to imagine because they don't have bodies at all. Angels have intellect and free will like us, right? But angels are pure souls. We are souls and bodies together. Angels are pure souls. And so the only way to tell them apart is by their levels of perfections, right? Some angels are more intelligent than others. Some angels are more powerful than others. They all have different combinations of perfections that God has given them. That's how we tell them apart. No two angels are identical. Now, do you guys know that Satan was once an angel? Okay, you probably have heard that, right? Anyone know what his name was before he became evil? Begins with an L. Lucifer, all right? So, part of this battle that I'm telling you guys about, that we're training to be soldiers for, is a battle between good and evil that goes all the way back to that original time when Lucifer and those who chose to follow him disobeyed God. They disobeyed God. And they disobeyed him on one specific point. Anyone remember what that was? God revealed to the angels that Jesus was coming, that the Lord would become one of us. Do you remember how Lucifer and his followers reacted? They rebelled against God because they could not stand the of bowing before a human being, which is what Jesus is. Jesus is God. We all know that. But Jesus is also human. Lucifer, the other ones who followed him, could not stand that idea. Think of it this way, guys. The difference between angelic nature and ours is huge. It's almost like, I don't know, we as a human being looking, oh, there's a cockroach there. The difference, to give you an idea of the difference, is that I'm not saying we're cockroaches. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying it's a huge difference. And so, if you keep that in mind, Lucifer could not stand the idea that they would submit to a physical creature, which was Jesus. Now, he's not a creature, I know that, but he was physical, and they couldn't understand, and they could not accept that idea. And so what the angel said is that they would rather suffer for all eternity and have their own way than to submit to God and be happy for all eternity.
We're going to talk about this when we get into demonology. We're going to talk about that. But he was the smartest, most intelligent. He had 12 wings. He was close to God. The name Lucifer in Spanish would be luz, right? What does luz mean? Light, exactly. He was the angel of light. He was handpicked by God, made by God, to be almost his right-hand man. But he rebelled. And the funny thing about what Josephine is saying right now about they're way smarter than that. The dumbest, most least educated angel in existence is vastly superior to the smartest person ever lived on this planet, other than Jesus. So their intelligence is way, way, way more than us. And when we get into angelology, we're going to talk about that. I'm going to explain it in great detail so it's going to blow your mind. So that's what Joseph is going to talk about. Okay?
And the thing that angels teach us is kind of like, anyone ever seen Lord of the Rings? You probably know that the orcs used to be elves, and the elves are greater and more dignified than men. The corruption of the best becomes the worst. And that's why there's nothing lower than the evil angels, even though they were at once the highest. But see, it's also a lesson for us. Because sometimes when we maybe have some success in something, or maybe we learn some stuff and we're really good at something, the temptation can be to think we're not better than God, of course, but to think that we're all that, when really everything just comes from God. So same thing, right? Pride. It's always pride. Pride made the angels go down to become demons. Pride can make us go down. And that's part of a big part of what we're going to talk about in today's lesson. All right, so there are two main kinds of angels, right? St. Thomas talks about many different ranks of angels, and he goes into detail about that. But for today's class, we can just kind of think of it as two main types. You've got the archangels, and the big three there are Gabriel, Michael, and Raphael. And those three appear throughout the Old Testament, New Testament. Gabriel's the one who made the announcement to the Blessed Virgin Mary. She'd be the mother of God. But the guardian angels were probably more important to us. Because see, each one of us in this room right now has his or her own guardian angel. And that angel's been with you since the very beginning. Your best buddy is your angel that you've never met. And Jesus himself tells us this, all right? Because Jesus himself, in Matthew 18:10 says, he's talking about how people were looking down on children, and they were not letting the children come to Jesus. So here's what he tells them. He says, take care that you do not despise one of these little ones. For I tell you, in heaven, their angels continually see the face of my Father in heaven. Right? So each one of your angels right now is beholding the face of God, but is also present here, protecting you and helping you out. Anyone ever have a really close call on a freeway where you should have crashed and you just didn't? Right? We've probably all had stuff like that. Our angels help us out. If anything bad ever happens to us, it's only because God is letting it happen, right? But for all these other times that we are protected and helped, it's that angel by our side. Jesus himself tells us about the existence of the guardian angels in this passage. All right, now we are moving somewhat fast, and here's why. We're kind of covering all of salvation history, which is at least 3,000 years. Actually, it's at least 4,000 years. And so, 4,000 years in 90 minutes. I'm not going to skip over anything important, but I'm not going to spend a ton of time on everything either, because what we're doing here is this is boot camp to become soldiers of Christ. All right? Let's talk about Genesis 1 through 3. The reason I separate Genesis 1 through 3 from the rest of the Bible is that the style that Genesis 1 through 3 is written in is a very different style. Here's why. It talks about Adam and Eve. It talks about them in the Garden of Eden. And it also talks about how everything was great. They were the crowning point of creation. And then they blew it. How did they blow it? They blew it by disobeying God. All right? But we all know the story. We know the story of Adam and Eve. But the reason I'm separating it here is because sometimes people are going to say, "Oh, I don't believe that Bible stuff. Don't you know about evolution? And don't you know about how old this earth is? And how can you tell me that was all done in 7 days? You Catholics, you don't know what you're talking about." No, they don't know what they're talking about. And I'm going to tell you why. All right, because in Genesis 1 through 3, what we have here is we have an author who knew nothing of science, living in a society that knew nothing about science. Not only did they know nothing of science, they didn't care about science. They didn't give a rip about science. And it's worse, from our point of view, they thought it was proud and disrespectful to study science. So they didn't do it. Now, what's my point? My point is that you can't hold Genesis 1 to 3 to the standards of science because these people knew nothing about science. It'd be like picking up a diary written by a first grader and he's talking about his scientific discoveries and his mathematical discoveries, right? And you look at that and you say, "Oh, this is a bunch of bull. Doesn't he know calculus? And doesn't he?" Well, of course he doesn't. He can't. That's the point, folks. Genesis 1 to 3 is unscientific, and so it is silly to try to make it fit into science. It is not supposed to fit into science. So don't even try. Now, am I saying, "Oh, it's just a bunch of symbols"? Heck no, I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that it's written as a story, just like other cultures and races of the time wrote stories, but it contains the truths of our creation. See, science talks about how things happen, but only religion and revelation can talk about why things happen. Genesis 1 through 3 doesn't have a thing to do with science because it doesn't tell us, and nor is it supposed to tell us how creation happened. It does tell us that God created everything. It does tell us that God created Adam and Eve and that the human race had two original parents, right? 6 days, 7 days. That's not the point, folks. The point is that it all comes from God. And God didn't have to make us, but he did because he loves us. He didn't need to make you, didn't need to make me. The world would be just fine without me right now. I could disappear, everything goes on. But see, he didn't have to make you, and yet he did because he loves you. A love that we can't even imagine. It's so great. See, this is the story, and this is the point of Genesis 1 through 3. It's not a science book. So if someone whacks you on the head with saying that the Catholic Church is anti-science, you need to whack them on the head back. And you got to say, "Well, look, buddy, these were written by people who didn't know a thing about science and actually thought it was silly and stupid to study science." You show them that you know better. I'm sorry, what were you going to say, Mike?
No, that's a great point because people always talk about the scientific method in regards to the earth and its existence, but they never talk about God in science. Now, maybe what I teach the teenagers in regards to evolution, they say that the world was made in 7 days. But see, God is everything. We're talking about the word awesome, and we're talking about that, and we're talking about God and his existence and stuff as Joseph moves on. But one of the things you want to take into consideration is that God is outside of time, he's outside of space, and he's outside of matter. So in other words, God now is outside of this time frame that we're looking at. He's outside of this. He's outside of space. This area, he's outside of this. Okay? And he's outside of matter. Books, clothes, the crucifix. He's outside of that. So to him, one day could be 7 million years. One day to him could be 33 seconds. There is no time, and there is no space, and there is no matter when it comes to God. So when they talk about this, they're not talking about 7 full days. It could be one day was 14 million years, like the scientists say. You're doing it for 14 million years. But then the second day, it could have been, again, 23 minutes. Who knows? We don't know. And when we get to heaven, God is going to let us know. When we get to heaven, we get to see this called a beatific vision. We get to see God face to face. And at that point, we will be infused with all the knowledge that God has because we are with Him. The angels already have that. So that's what Joseph was talking about. They have that knowledge. So again, the dumbest angel in heaven is vastly superior in intellect than we are here on earth. So when they talk about that, and we're going to get into a little later on too about natural law, the natural law. When I teach the children, I teach always, it is never, I had a dollar every time. They always ask them when I talk about natural law and time. First question you ask is, what about the dinosaurs? And give it that. That's always a fun conversation to have because I explain it in this particular type. So that's what we're talking about.
So the point is, you don't fall into their trap, right? Their trap is they want you to fit your beliefs into science because they think, oh, science has all the answers. Well, it doesn't. Science can never tell you why anything happened. The main point is that it just doesn't matter for this discussion. What does matter is that we come from God. And what also matters is what happened next. And that's why I'm putting here Genesis 4 to Malachi means Genesis 4 all the way to the end of the Old Testament is a different style. Here we are talking about historical things that happened. Now, maybe it's not always clear exactly how the things happened, but the important thing is that they did happen. All right, and so this is the story of Adam and his descendants, Noah and the flood, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses. It's the story of how God led the people out of Egypt into the promised land. And all of this sets the stage for the biggest moment of history and the very meaning of our lives, which is that God became one of us. Right? St. Athanasius, great church doctor, he said it this way, a way that I love. He said, God became human so that man could become divine. I'll say that again. God became human so that man could become divine. God took on our human nature, became one of us, precisely so that he could share with us his divine nature and confer that upon us. You see, the link between us and Christ is so intimate, all because he became one of us. He took on our nature. All right, so Genesis 4 through Malachi, they are historical. Now, there are some symbolic books in there, such as Job, Psalms, and stuff, but these are things that happened. And the point of history is that history, it shows us how God works with his people. Now, I'm going to give you a quote from the Catechism, but when I give you a quote that's long, I don't expect you to write it down, because then you'll all be distracted with writing it down. What I do want you to do with the long quotes is understand what they mean. And then when I give you where it comes from after that, you can maybe read it more on your own later. Does that make sense? All right, so when the church reads the Old Testament, she searches there for what the Spirit, who has spoken through the prophet, wants to tell us about Christ. By prophets, the faith of the church here understands all whom the Holy Spirit inspired in living proclamation and in the composition of the sacred books, both of the Old and the New Testaments. Jewish tradition distinguishes first the law, then the prophets, which correspond to our historical and prophetic books, and finally the writings. Notice I'm holding up 4 fingers because this is the Catholic division of the Old Testament. We're going to talk a little bit more about that right now. But when you get your catechisms, number 702 talks more about the Old Testament. So again, don't write the quote, but understand that this kind of introduces how there are 4 main parts of the Old Testament. Okay, now let's understand those parts. The first part is the Law or Torah. So the Law or Torah, sometimes called the Pentateuch, first 5 books of the Bible, right? You got Genesis, Exodus. Anyone know the third? Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, right? Now, all that stuff, you guys want to read that later, it tells the same story. And that's the story of creation. We've got patriarchs, Abraham, Jacob, and his sons. We have Moses coming out of Egypt to the promised land, and all the wonders that God did for the chosen people as he led them out of Egypt. All right, that's the first part. Second part, so we're breaking up the Old Testament into four main parts here. Next part, historical books. So here's what I recommend for your notes. Again, I don't want you distracted and say, I gotta write. No. But you should be writing right now, part 1, Law or Torah. Part 2, historical books. That you should be writing. And then be understanding the explanation. All right, so historical books describe the entry of the Hebrew people into the land of Canaan, the land promised to Abraham and his descendants by God. They tell about the conquest of the land, the establishment of the monarchy. That's when they wanted to have kings rule over them. And the lives of Saul, David, and Solomon. David and Solomon, well, these three were the first three kings of the Jewish people. They also recount the division of Davidic kingdom into Israel, the north, and Judah, the south, after the death of Solomon. So, unfortunately, yes, we have these great kings, but after Solomon dies, it all falls apart. And it's sad, but it's the sad story caused by human sin and pride. Because these chosen people, taken out of Egypt, treated so kindly by God, you know what they kept doing? They kept turning their backs on God. And they would worship the false god, and then they would, start getting into immoral practices forbidden by the law, and then they'd get punished and come back, and then shortly after that, they'd turn their backs on God again. See, that's the story. All this war and all this pain is because they kept turning their backs on God. And we wish they didn't do that, but isn't that what we do? And what I'm saying, folks, is it's easy for us to point the fingers at these guys and say, oh, they were a bunch of slops. They didn't know the good thing they had. And that's true. But that's us too, God is so good to us. We're sinners. So we fall. But thank God we've got confession. We can come back. You see, that pattern of us, we want to do well. We do well for a while, then we fall, but then we change our ways. That's the pattern that happened with the Jewish people. It's the pattern of our lives because we're always struggling against this sinful nature. Pretty soon we're going to talk about why we have the sinful nature. All right, but hold on, we're just talking right now about the main types of the Old Testament. All right, third type, prophetic books. You should write that down. Prophetic books, don't write the rest down. They take place at the same time as the historical books during the divided kingdom. So they're happening at the same time. The prophets give some historical references in their writings, but the focus of the prophetic message is theological. They're trying to teach the people lessons of how to live and how to love God. The prophets speak for God and give explanations, exhortations, and sometimes harsh criticism. So just going back really fast, you see here the Assyrian Empire who took over, and then you see how they fell to the Babylonians. You know what, guys? These were punishments that Yahweh warned them would happen if they didn't stop turning their backs on him. But see, they didn't stop turning their backs on him, and God let them fall into the hands of enemies. All right, fourth and final of the Old Testament types is the wisdom literature, or the writings. All right, diverse collection of books not tied historically to any one person or time, but contains the long tradition of wisdom developed by the covenant people through the years. Greatest of these are the Psalms. We read that every Sunday in Mass. After the first reading, before the second, you guys hear the Psalms every Sunday. And even today, this is the official prayer book of the church. It's the prayer hymnal. It was for the Jews, and it is for now, for us, for Catholics. Other wisdom literature includes proverbs and instructions on how to live righteously according to God's design. Now, the book of Job, this is a fascinating book. The book of Job is actually the oldest book in the Bible. It's older than Genesis. See, there was a written book of Job before there was a written creation story. But the book of Job is not meant to tell the story of a historical person named Job. It's meant to tell us a great lesson. Does anyone know the lesson of Job? We're not going to read the whole book now. But does anyone know the main lesson of Job? It's a simple one-liner. The lesson of Job is, even when things don't make sense, even when you're suffering and things get taken away from you, trust in God. know that he loves you, and know that he's in control. That's the lesson of Job, a lesson that is still so important for our times. It's easy to trust in God when everything's going well, but when things don't go well and things don't make sense, that's when it's harder to trust in God. See? But Job teaches us that even in those times, the darkest times, we know that God loves us, and he's always going to come through in the end in ways that maybe we don't understand. All right, so these are the four main types of the Old Testament, and that is the lead-in. Notice the last part here, suffering and its meaning, is the big lead-in to the main part of tonight's lesson, which is, why is there so much pain? All right, God's so good. Yeah, okay, that sounds great. But why am I hurting? Why is my friend hurting? Why, when these atheists tell me, hey, you shouldn't believe in God because all this pain and evil, why do I sometimes think that they might be right? Okay, this is a huge thing that we all got to answer for ourselves. And we're going to see that it has everything to do with creation and salvation history. All right, so suffering and its meaning is the next point. And here's the big question, folks. The question that non-believers will ask you. If there is evil and suffering in the world, then God is not omnipotent or not benevolent. This means omnipotent, so all-powerful. So what the atheists tell us is, hey, you got all this suffering, that means God, he can't do anything about it, so he's not all-powerful. Or maybe they say, hey, God can do everything about it, but he's not benevolent, he's not a good God, because a good God wouldn't let such terrible things happen. And the question sounds pretty powerful if you don't know the background. And that's what we're going to get into now, okay? First thing to remember is this. All right, so this is kind of it sounds like an abstract concept, but it's simpler than it sounds. It's simpler than it sounds. Evil's a privation. A privation is just when something isn't there. All right, so I'll give you an example. Let's say somebody is born with only one eye. All right, well, the eye that's not there, that's what we would say is an evil. Not an evil like a sin type of evil, but an evil because something isn't there that should be. All right, this is what we mean by privation. It's when something's missing. So all evil, right, is a lack of being. You can think of it too as if light shines in the darkness, well, how would you see the light if there weren't the darkness? If we know something exists, how do we know existence unless we somehow compare it to non-existence? You know what I mean? And so if I know the difference between existence and non-existence, that really is the difference between good and evil. Evil is a lack. God doesn't make evil. Evil is a lack of God's presence. To accuse God of making evil is as silly as saying, God, because you exist, I blame you for all things that don't exist. You can't do that. It makes no sense. Right? God, because evil's here, I blame you because you should do something about it. No. That's like saying the sun should curse all the darkness around it because there's no star there. It just doesn't make sense. You can't do it. It's not a rational way to behave. All right. So the first thing to remember is evil simply is a privation. Now, the next thing is where it all comes from. And this is where the story gets sad. Original sin broke our nature. It broke our nature. And you know, our nature is to love and serve God. We were created by God to serve him, not because God's some kind of egomaniac. He doesn't need us. God made us to love him because that is our greatest happiness. God was being generous when he gave us life. And when he tells us to love him, it's for our own good. That's the best thing for us. Well, guess what? He told Adam and Eve. He gave them a command. And these creatures who were made to obey, when they disobeyed, they broke their nature. They broke it. Completely ruptured it. And when you rupture something, there's going to be consequences. There's got to be consequences. And that's why we have salvation history, folks. Okay.
Can I say something about that?
Yeah.
How many of you know what Joseph's talking about when it comes to original sin? How many of you remember that in your teaching before? Hands up if you remember the original sin. You remember that? Okay. Maybe you could
Yeah.
just
So let's talk about what original sin is. All right. So I told you generally what it is it's the creature who's created to obey, who suddenly disobeys, going against the nature and breaking it. But now let's talk about what actually happened. In Genesis 1 through 3, God puts them in the Garden of Eden, and all things are there for their benefit, right? But he does give them a command. He says, "You shall not eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. You shall not eat of that tree. Because if you do, you surely shall die." It's literally what Yahweh told them. And Adam and Eve were fine with that, okay, until the enemy came along, the serpent. Now, was it a serpent? Again, I told you that doesn't matter. What matters is that the enemy came. And the enemy came to convince Adam and Eve that God was a power hungry maniac who didn't want them to know good and evil, and therefore gave them this command to not eat the fruit. And so the enemy, Satan, made God look like the bad guy and convinced Adam and Eve to eat of the fruit. Thus, he tricked them. And so here's the first sin, actually. Some people say first sin of Adam and Eve was disobedience. The Catechism will tell you that the first sin was distrust and disobedience. Distrust comes before disobedience. Satan made them not trust in God and think that God was trying to control them. And because he convinced them of that, they disobeyed. Okay, so this is what Michael's referring to. This is what original sin actually was. Now, again, I'm going to keep going back to this because your non-believer friends are going to keep going back to it. Oh, yeah, was it an apple? Was it a snake? Who cares? That is not the point, folks. It is not the point. What is the point is that it was something God commanded. Satan did tempt them, and they disobeyed. What exactly did they do? Maybe we won't know until the final judgment. But that's not the point. The point is that they disobeyed after they distrusted, and Satan made them distrust. It, it's both. It's yeah.
They call it both and.
It's both ends.
Both and.
Yeah. It's
both and it's the same. And I have
exactly.
a little writing about that. It said
Yeah.
It's not either or, but
It's both and. It's both and that happened at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When you talk, now you actually hit on a really good point because that's one of the first things you teach in theology class is it's not either or, but it's both and. That's how God operates.
Yeah.
God operates in both love and love, not love or love. He operates both ways, not both ways, only the one. But it's because of that, it's both and. Okay? That's a really good point.
And I'm glad you brought that up too, Frank, because it's such a great lesson for our lives. A lot of times, when we're tempted to do something bad. It's because we see something good in it. Maybe it's a pleasure. Maybe it's, I don't know, something that's going to give us money, whatever. We see some good in it. But you know why we're tempted to go after that good? Because deep down inside, we're kind of not trusting that God is enough for us. So what Adam and Eve did, we kind of do every time we sin. Okay, let's go back to the first part of the story, because you see, when they broke their nature, it had tremendous consequences. And I'd like to give some examples that might seem silly, but I think they'll illustrate what happened with original sin. Okay, so let's pretend that you're really hungry one day, and maybe you got a sweet tooth, you like candies, you like Skittles, you like bright looking candies, and you find this bag. And yeah, you understand the Spanish, right? And you know what it says. And it says, rat poison. Kills rats. But it looks so good. Gosh, look at that red stuff. And oh man, that reminds me of Skittles. And I just want to eat it. And then you turn it around, and it says, warning, not for human consumption. If you eat this, you will get sick and perhaps die. Right? Danger of sickness or death. And you're like, eh. Then you turn it to the other side, but it looks so good. and I'm so hungry, and I got my sweet tooth. And so what do? You pop one, you pop another one. And pretty soon you pop half that bag, right? Well, what's going to happen to you? You're probably going to get sick, and you probably are going to die. Now, here's the question. This is why I'm bringing you the example. If you die from that rat poison that you ate like candy, is God punishing you? God's not punishing you. You brought it on yourself. It's a consequence of a silly choice that you made, even though there were warnings. You guys see how that kind of goes with what Adam and Eve did. There were warnings, they had the warnings, but it looked so good. And Satan made it look so good. In spite of the warnings, they took it. Now, that doesn't mean, oh, God said, you were bad, bam. I'm kicking you out of the garden, bam. No, the punishment came from the fact that their nature was ruptured. Just like the punishment here would come from the fact that you ate something that does not belong in a human stomach. I'll give you another example. Let's pretend you got this pet dolphin in your backyard. And I know it's silly, but you'll see what makes sense in a second. And so you got this saltwater pool in your backyard, and you and your buddy, let's call him, I don't know, let's call him Davy, random name. You and your buddy Davy, you've had him for years. He's such a smart dolphin, and you understand all his little clicks, and he understands your speech, and you guys are just best buds. And every day you give him his favorite fish, right? But one day, you got to go on this business trip. You're going to be away for 3 weeks. You've never been away from Davy that long. And so remember, Davy understands you. You understand Davy. And you say, Davy, I'm going to leave for 3 weeks, buddy. But I've got my auto feeder to give you your favorite fish. And it's going to come down several times a day. And you're going to just, you'll be fine. And then when we get back, we're going to have a great old time together. And we'll swim together and have fun. Okay. But see, Davy is intelligent and curious. And you know that. And so you say, Davy, I know that you are curious about the world out here, the dry land world. But please, Davy, don't leave your pool. And don't go exploring, because you could really get hurt. And you could really get injured. I don't want that to happen to you, Davy, because I love you so much. All right, so you go on your business trip. Come back 3 weeks later. You go straight to that backyard saltwater pool, and you look. He's not there. And then you frantically look through the house. You think maybe he's flopping through the house. I hope not, but maybe he's not in the house. You go to the neighbor. Neighbor, is he here? No. And you start driving all over the neighborhood until finally you're driving by, and out of the corner of your eye, you see something kind of twitching by the gutter. And you rush over, and you find that the baby is twitching by the gutter. Desperately trying to get it out of that hole to some water that he really needs. But it's too late. You grab baby, and he dies. Now let's ask this. Did you punish Davy? No, you didn't punish Davy. Davy brought it on himself because he did what was contrary to his nature. His nature was to be an aquatic mammal. He ventured out into the dry land. Our nature is to be an obedient creature of God. And we broke that nature by disobeying God. Just as there were consequences for Davy, there are huge consequences for us. And everything in our lives, folks, that causes pain and suffering, everything in our lives that's unpleasant, it's all a consequence of this original breaking of nature. Now, there are many other questions that may be coming up now, and we're going to get to those. But the thing I want you all to understand is that it's not that God had to punish Adam and Eve. What happened is they brought it on themselves. And since God respects our freedom, right, he's not going to undo our choices. That if I respect Davy's freedom, right, there's no way I can bring him back and suddenly put water on him and bring him back to life. Same thing. Once original sin broke our nature, there was only one way to fix it. And that's Jesus Christ. Now, how that happens is the next part of the story. Okay. All right, so here's kind of a recap. We were created to live for and with God. The rebellion against our purpose nature brought terrible consequences. We broke our nature, and so it's going to bring consequences. Not only Adam and Eve suffered the repercussions, but so did all of their descendants. Just like a pregnant heroin addict passes the addiction on to her baby, and we all know that happens, Adam and Eve transmitted their sinfulness. So we might say, oh gosh, Adam and Eve, that was them. I wasn't there. Well, see, the thing is, we have human nature that comes from their human nature. And that human nature gets passed on and passed on and passed on. This is why we all suffer the consequences of original sin. It's because they passed on that broken human nature, a nature that they themselves broke. Yeah.
Not good. The tendency to do bad. We all have. We all have. Every one of us. There's nothing we can do about it. But if we recognize that we have it, then we can be able to correct it and then work harder and put our trust back in God. For example, I tell this to the kids, and they love this. Pretend one day you're walking down the street, you went shopping yourself, and you're walking past the liquor store, and you see the doors are open, it's a nice day, the doors are open, there's a big rack of potato chips. Oh, cool, my favorite chips are right there. You watch your stuff, you see the chips. Then you look inside, and you see that the owner is screaming and yelling at the meat guy, and screaming and yelling stuff, and there's nobody around. You look around, nobody around. Cars passing the food, 40 miles. I'm hungry. That's concupiscence. The tendency to do what you're not supposed to do. That tendency to do. He's not going to miss it out $1.29. No way. But it does. Eternal. That's the same. We'll talk about the Ten Commandments.
And that's what we have every time we sin, right? It's we do it because there's something about it that's appealing. We don't do it because, oh, it's a terrible thing to do. I just want to do terrible things. No, it's because we're attracted to it. We're attracted to it. That's concupiscence. Now, their fallen nature then was passed on to us. So another example, we talked about the heroin addict passing her addiction on. But in medieval times, you see, what happened is if a landowner had tons of land, give to his heirs, if he were convicted of a crime, that was all taken away. And what he should have been able to pass on to his heirs, he no longer can because of a crime he committed. That's pretty much what happened with us. All their gifts that they had in the garden, that state of original justice, which is what it's called, was lost with original sin. They couldn't pass it on to us anymore. Now, St. Paul says this in the letter to the Romans. And if you want to take one book of St. Paul that is like the best book of them all, that's got everything that's great about St. Paul, all in one book, it's Romans. In Romans, he talks about all this stuff. Notice what he says. Therefore, sin came into the world through one man, and death came through sin. So death spread to all. Death came to all because of what the head of the human race did. And who was the head of the human race? It was Adam. Who's going to become the new head? Well, we shall see. Now, this is a little philosophical, but this is what St. Thomas talks about in the Summa. You probably heard of the Summa Theologiae. It was a book that Thomas Aquinas wrote. He's one of the greatest theologians of all time. So he put it like this. When he's talking about original justice, this is the state of things in the garden before they messed everything up. Creation was subject to man. Creation, so animals, plants, everything natural you can imagine was subject to man. The body was subject to the soul. The body could do whatever the soul wanted it to. The senses were subject to reason. So our senses, that we use, sometimes get ahead of us. The reason doesn't govern them. But them, reason always governed the senses. And reason itself was subject to God. Notice how everything's in order. And when everything's in this order, all is happy and all is good. But what happens? When sin fractured our nature, notice it wasn't just them breaking their nature, it was wreaking havoc on the whole order of the cosmos. That's why it was so serious. And again, look, Romans. And as I told you before, when it comes to a long passage, don't write the passage, just write the citation and go over it later. Notice what St. Paul says here. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. The creation was subjected to futility, not of its own will, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay. Notice that he's talking here. He's talking here about the earth and the planets. He's talking about all of creation. See, why I'm telling you guys this is if we think that original sin only affects human beings, we're wrong. Original sin affected the entire universe, the entire created universe. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labor pains until now. Not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly while we wait for adoption and the redemption of our bodies. So Paul, he knows well this struggle, and he knows what has happened because of original sin. Okay, let's go back to the diagrams. Okay, so what diagrams am I talking about? Creation, man, body, soul, senses, reason, God. These four, which should be in your notes. You should have the four arrows there. Now we're going to go back and let's see what happened specifically. Before the fall, man was capable of suffering and dying, but didn't. After the fall, suffering and death became necessary. Why? Because creation is no longer subject to man. Bam. And this is why lions can eat us. Lions can't eat us. Lions can eat us. Lions can't eat us. Lions can eat us. That sounds simple, but that's because it is. Before original sin, before we messed everything up, all creation was subject to man. There is no animal that would have hurt man. But because we messed it up, creation is no longer subject to man, but we are at the mercy of the forces of nature. Next, what happened? The body is no longer subject to the soul. This is why. Here, can't die. Here, you die. Can't die, die. Can't die, die. Why is this can't die? Because the soul has complete control over the body. So much so that in the state of original justice, you could slice through that hand and it would just reknit. Why? Because the soul has power over the body. But now that this is broken, folks, now that this is broken, the soul is no longer in control and the soul can get separated from the body. This is death. Before original sin, no death. After original sin, death. Before the fall, man was capable of sinning, but didn't. After the fall, sin became almost inevitable because, now let's look at the next two diagrams. If the senses are subject to the reason, then you don't have what Michael just said. You don't have getting the chips when you shouldn't, because your reason tells you, oh no, I shouldn't do the chips because that's wrong, right? But see, because of concupiscence, like he was explaining, now the senses are not subject to the reason. The senses take over and they make you do things that you shouldn't. And the reason is not subject to God anymore. This is how we can have such proud ideas in our heads and start thinking the wrong way about things, rebelling against God in our minds. Why? Because our reason is no longer subject to God. And all of these red X's, folks, every single one of them is because of original sin.
Also, too, Joseph said a great point there because they missed it. Proud. Very proud. That is the number one deadly sin of the seven deadly sins. Number one, pride. We all have it. We all use it. We all live it. Unless you recognize it, then you will have control over it. That is what got Lucifer thrown out of heaven. He was proud. I'm not going to subject myself to a human being. Are you kidding? I'm better than he is. Boom. And it says in the Bible, we're not going to do it now, but we'll show you later on. Jesus says that, I saw you fall like a bolt of lightning from the heavens. Talking about pride. But the one person, as we talk about God now, Jesus, God, the God man, 100% God, 100% man, like I said last week. But the one person, one creature created on this planet from the beginning of time till now, who did not have pride because she was conceived without sin, the most perfect creature ever to walk the face of the earth. And we're going to get into that later as it goes on, because she did not have any pride. She said yes to God. And the whole world was changed. We're going to get into that later on.
And Mary also had no concupiscence.
No confusion. Because she did have the original sin. But she did not without original sin.
She wasn't attracted to sin like we are. So the undeserved grace of original justice was lost, right? Original justice is that state when you don't have the red X's. And the state that we're in now, fallen nature, is when you do have the red X's. And could only be restored through the undeserved mercy of God. Now let's turn our attention to how our fallen nature is restored. So what we've talked about so far, folks, is we are broken, and here's why we are broken. And up until now, it all sounds really depressing. But Christianity is not depressing. So all that we're going to talk about now is some really good news. We're going to talk about how God took this situation and fixed it in the only way that he could have fixed it. All right. So we're going to talk now about how our fallen nature was restored. Now, our fallen nature was restored. Just a second. Okay, yeah. All right. Before we talk about specifically how God did it, specifically how he restored our fallen nature, let's talk about something called justice. You guys, we all have heard of justice, and you probably didn't know that there are three aspects of justice, okay? And they're simple, and they'll all make sense, okay? So here are the three aspects. You've got correction, and correction is a kind of justice. You also have retribution and reward. Now, do you think I could try to write something up? You got retribution. Retribution, correction, and reward. Now, justice is built into the order of the cosmos. And if God doesn't change the order of the cosmos, right? And he has mercy on us, but mercy is always together with justice. They're not separable. But I'm just going to run through quickly what these are. Retribution is the easiest to understand. That's payback. You guys heard of karma? Goes around, comes around. You do bad, eventually it's going to come back to you. You do good, eventually come back to you. Retribution is payback. Payback as in reward. Payback as in punishment. But usually it's payback as in punishment. Correction. Correction is why we call jails correctional facilities. The idea there is that justice has to be done in making the sinner better and try to make that criminal a productive member of society. We want to correct that criminal. And reward is what it sounds like. It's giving good to those who deserve it. So three aspects of justice. And by the way, correction here includes reparation. So let's say a kid breaks a neighbor's window playing baseball outside with his brothers. Well, all right, maybe mom and dad will give him some punishment to try to correct him, help him mend his ways, be more careful. But there's also got to be some reparation, which is you got to repair the damage done to the window. Okay, so correction includes reparation. All right, so let's talk about how justice was happening before the Incarnation, which is this depressing state that we've talked about until now. So retribution was happening, but was insufficient because hell was deserved. In other words, after Adam and Eve, after they fell and everyone came after them, there was tons of suffering, tons of death and sickness and war and crime and stuff like that. In other words, retribution was happening. But it wasn't enough because since they were separated from God, they all deserved hell. Well, how about correction? Well, correction could happen, but it generally wasn't. We see this in the Old Testament. They keep turning their backs on God, although God's so good to them, because even though God is trying to correct them, they're so hardened in their ways that they can't be corrected. So corrective justice, God was trying to do it, but man in his sinfulness couldn't be corrected. And reward just couldn't happen because everything that man did before the incarnation, the human beings did, was worthless in God's eyes because it was stained by concupiscence. All right, now the good news. The good news is, bam, bam, and I'm going to circle it because this, folks, this is the good news. The incarnation is the very essence of Christianity. It's not the cross. It's not the resurrection. It's the incarnation. Now, why? Because the incarnation includes the cross, includes the public life, includes the resurrection. The incarnation includes everything about Jesus. The incarnation is the central truth of Christianity. It is the meaning of our lives. The incarnation regenerated human nature. It's like doing a restart. You get this car that's all messed up, right? And you got to work on it, and you just change everything. You change the engine, you change the guts, you regenerate that car. The incarnation regenerated us. Here we are, broken, battered, ruptured nature, all these terrible consequences. And what does God do? He comes in and becomes one of us. He loved us so much that he became one of us. Let's go back to the cockroach example. I know we're not cockroaches, I'm not saying that, but let's say difference between me and a cockroach. It'd be like me becoming a cockroach for the good of the cockroaches. This is how much of a sacrifice it was for the divine Jesus to take on humanity. And sometimes, folks, we take it for granted. Sometimes we just get used to it. Oh, yeah, Jesus. Yeah, but you got to realize Jesus is the meaning of life. Jesus is who we are. He is the new head of the body. Adam was the old head. When Jesus became one of us, he became the new head, and we are the members of that body. You know how they talk about the adoption of the Father? Well, we are all adopted children of the Father. And you know how that works? Because we're cells of Christ, who is the Son of the Father. And since he's the Son and we're part of Jesus, we're cells of Jesus, then by extension, we're adopted sons of the Father. So I'm going to keep going back to this point over and over because this is the meaning of life.
I was saying he's the answer. And that's a little joke my niece and I used to say all the time. Jesus is the answer. Jesus is the answer. He's the answer to everything. We should say, well, is Jesus the answer to, like, I said, he's the answer. Well, what's 72 times 39? Jesus. That's a joke. But you stop to think about it. You're looking for that answer. You're looking for that hope. You're looking for that that's going to get you over the top or it's going to get you there. Put your trust in Jesus. He is the answer. Really is the answer.
And so when he regenerated our nature, he did it by taking on our humanity. So now he's got a body. He was a weak, helpless baby. He had to be taught how to walk and how to do stuff, right? He took on all the limitations of humanity. But because he became the new head of the human race, he transmitted to us divine nature. You guys know, you probably know this. What's that moment in your lives when that divine nature was transmitted to you? Can anyone remember? You guys want to take a guess? Exactly. Your baptism is the moment that you were adopted by God the Father. You were adopted by God the Father because in your baptism, the divine nature of Jesus was transmitted to you, making you a cell in this body of Jesus. This is how amazing, folks, the incarnation is. It's so amazing you could think about it every day and still not get to the bottom of the mystery. And we should. We all, truthfully, I do too. We all should. It's something that I would encourage you just not to take the stuff for granted anymore. It doesn't mean everyone's got to become a theologian. It doesn't mean that. It just means appreciate it, appreciate it. Appreciate what he did for you. Appreciate the Mass. So, yeah.
One of the things that Nelson and I were talking about when we first met is like we're big fans of a nun. Her name is Mother Mary of the Lamb of God. She used to be Jewish, and then for 18, after she realized the fullness of Judaism was the Christian faith, so she became a Christian, and she was an evangelical Christian. And for 18 years, she tried to get Catholics not to be Catholic. But as she continued to study more and more and more, you guys can go online and look at the story. It's a phenomenal story. She became Catholic, but she studied her way into the Catholic faith. And not only that, but she studied her way so much that she actually became a nun. So now she actually leads a priory over in Kansas. And one of the things she says is one of the greatest offense humanity has ever done is kill God. We kill God. We do that by our sins. When we sin, what we're doing is we're putting those lashes back on Jesus. When we sin, we're driving the nails into not realistically, but perversely, we are doing what he came to do to save us from our sins and open up the gates of heaven. Now, Joseph was talking about the rewards back in the old days before Jesus, when the Jewish people died. And we're going to talk about heaven, hell, and purgatory later on. But how do you know a little bit about purgatory? How many of you know about purgatory? We're going to talk about purgatory. But in the Jewish religion, it wasn't called purgatory, it's called Sheol. And that purgatory / Sheol is a huge speed bump, roadblock. The Protestants versus the Catholics. They do not believe, because they say, well, purgatory is not in the Bible. Well, neither is the word Trinity. Neither is the word Incarnation.
It's not in the Bible.
Yeah, but it's implied because it's tradition, and this is what the Catholic faith has always been about. It's tradition. The Protestants don't believe that. And that's also one of the things, not only atheists, but Protestants too. They will come at you about the Blessed Virgin Mary, and we'll come at you about purgatory too. So you'll need to know this. And we'll talk about that as time moves on. But we do have a section here where we talk about heaven, hell, and purgatory.
And we'll talk about how you can answer these questions that Protestants will have. They're simple questions, simple answers, but we need to be prepared with those answers. That's why I really encourage you guys to come to class, because the stuff that we learn here, it's life and death. You can skip a class, maybe you take at a college or whatever, and still do all right in the course. But skipping one of these classes, maybe the Holy Spirit has just what you need to hear in that class. Now, I know it's not always possible. That's why we'll try to record, but try to come, because God wants you here. All right. Now let's talk more about our happy news. Why is it happy news? Because if we are now participants in divine nature, then the whole thing changes. And suddenly, justice is fulfilled because of God's mercy. Justice, divine mercy.
I live by divine mercy now. Now that I understand it, I love doing divine mercy because it's Jesus giving us what we need.
All right, so how does retribution get carried out? Well, it still happens, and we all know that. We're still suffering payback, so to speak, because we all have, things that go wrong, sicknesses, death, stuff like that. So it's still happening. It hasn't changed. But notice what has changed. What has changed is that now, because we're participants in divine nature, it's sufficient retribution, which means that we don't belong in hell anymore. The second part is correction. Back, the Israelites, they couldn't be corrected. They were too hardened in their ways. But we can be corrected. It takes a long time and it takes a lot of effort, and maybe it'll take us years to get there. We keep getting up when we fall, but little by little, we can become better because of the incarnation. And the best thing is that we couldn't get reward back then before the incarnation, but now we can actually get reward. See, people always talk about justice. Oh, yeah, getting bad stuff. No, justice is very positive in the sense that if you do good, you can really be rewarded for it. We can merit rewards now because we can unite our merits to those of Christ. We can even unite our sufferings to the sufferings of Christ in order to gain merits for ourselves and for the people that we love.
I like to call them blessings. In my role, I like to call them blessings. I get them all the time without me even knowing them. It's only because I submit myself at that moment or that time frame. I submit myself to God's will. I try desperately to try to do that, and I get blessings. And as time moves on, I'm going to tell you the bits and pieces of what those blessings are going to have. You think it's like, oh, what a miracle! No, a miracle is something that cannot be explained by science and reason and logic. But a blessing is something that, wow, that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. And I'm going to tell you all about this.
All right, so let's continue the good news. And the question we have to ask ourselves, all right, incarnation is great, regeneration of human nature, but why do we still suffer? What's the meaning of that? Well, there are a few reasons for it. First thing is that, we can't stop retribution and correction from happening. Yes, we do participate in God's nature. Yes, everything changed now because of the incarnation, but we're still on this planet living this life, and so there's still some pain that we suffer. The next part you guys are well aware of. God allows people the freedom to offend him and to hurt each other. So God doesn't want me to go over and right? But I have the freedom to do it. So my point is, right, sometimes we suffer pain because people do bad things to us. And they do bad things because they're still free to do those things. Does that make sense? All right, so it's not that God's going to take away all people's freedom now that there's the incarnation. He doesn't. He respects our freedom. And the third and probably most mysterious reason is that God can use evil and suffering to bring about a greater good. Something that in the moment seems terrible can end up being exactly what needed to happen so that something wonderful could happen. I'm going to give you some simple examples. All right, first example, really quick. Anyone ever see this old show called Little House on the Prairie? Or have you ever heard of it? Okay, all right. Little House on the Prairie, Bonanza. Little House on the Prairie is a classic, right? And it's about this family of settlers. They're in the West frontier land, and about their life and times and all the things they deal with. Well, the main actor was Michael Landon, and he was in that show for 20 years, and he did some other things too. But let me tell you Michael Landon's brief story. All right, Michael Landon originally was not an actor. He was a javelin thrower. This was his passion. This is what he did in middle school and high school, and he was a really good javelin thrower. Right? He set school records. He was an Olympic hopeful, and it looked like he was going to go to the Olympics, and he was a contender to win a gold. Well, what happened is, so he was at USC at the time. He had a javelin throwing scholarship, and before practice, he was just warming up, just throwing some light javelins before doing the heavy ones. And as he was warming up in one throw, he suddenly heard a big rip and a terrible pain. So he went to the doctor, and they checked it out, and the diagnosis was grim. He said, Michael, if you're lucky, you'll be able to use the arm again, but you're definitely never, ever going to throw. Can you imagine how crushed he was? He was crushed. He went into this deep depression for months. He didn't want to live. He said it was the darkest time of his life. And one day, he was just kind of moseying around campus, right? Still kind of suicidal. And he saw a flyer on a wall for an audition for a play. And his friend saw the same flyer, and his friend, who was his roommate at the time, said, hey, let's try out. What the heck? It'll be fun. Maybe we'll meet some girls. And so they go to the audition, and his friend doesn't get the part, but Michael does. And Michael discovered that he had this great talent and passion for acting. One thing led to another, and he eventually landed this very famous role, Little House on the Prairie. But here's the cool thing. He was being interviewed years after, and the interviewer, I don't remember who it was. I know he was on Johnny Carson several times, and he was on The Tonight Show a few times too, Saturday Night Live stuff. But the interviewer said, "Hey, can you tell us what was the worst day in your life?" And he said, "Oh, definitely when I tore my shoulder." He told him how painful it was. So later on in the interview, the interviewer says, "Well, what was the best day in your life?" Same day. Same day. Do you know why he said that? Because he realized that if he hadn't had the accident, he wouldn't have discovered his passion for acting. He would have just stayed in that career. Maybe he'd have done all right, but he wouldn't have found his true calling, which was to be an actor. All right. So what Michael recognized in that interview is that something terrible in the moment, even though we don't understand it, could be part of God's plan, and he can bring a great good out of that. Another quick story. I've got this friend, Ed. I changed his last name, but actually I know Ed and his family pretty well. So Ed was a star football player. He was a wide receiver, and he was at the University of Colorado. And one time they had a game up in Oregon, and I think it was a playoff game. I don't remember. It wasn't a bowl game, but Ed was a junior at the time, junior in college, and the pro teams were already calling him. They already calling him. He already had an informal agent to handle the calls, and he was just going to go NFL. He was that good. But in this Oregon game, he went up to catch a pass, right? And it was a touchdown pass. And he did land in the end zone. But because as he caught it in the air, someone else came to tackle him, he flipped in the air and landed in the end zone on his head. So we're talking about a pretty high fall. You know, he jumped up, got flipped, so his head fell about that far. And that's enough to kill people. Actually, it does kill people. He didn't die. He went into a coma for 6 months. And at the end of 6 months, fortunately, he woke up. But here's the little backstory, and it's why I'm including his story here. Before the accident, Ed's parents were in the middle of a bitter divorce, and they hated each other. And Ed is one of 6 kids. And so the siblings were divided. Some on mom's side, some on dad's side. And now the siblings were hating each other. Okay. But when the accident happened, suddenly Ed, the superstar, is in a coma. Well, mom and dad did 12-hour shifts. Mom would do midnight to noon. Dad would do noon to midnight. That was it. They didn't talk to each other. They couldn't even stand being in the same room as each other. But this was 6 months, folks. And so little by little, maybe she would stay until 12:05. And he arrived at 12, so they had about 5 minutes of, uncomfortable conversation. And then the 5 minutes became 10. And then the 10 became 30. Until the great day happened when he woke up. Now, they still didn't like each other. But when he woke up, because they both loved him, they both rejoiced. And then they worked together to teach him how to eat, how to walk, how to talk, to teach him just like they had when he was a little baby. Happy ending. They discovered their love, became an exemplary couple, and started a ministry to help families and couples all over Colorado. I know these people, right? But see, here's the thing. Terrible accident. But because God knows how to do this, God was able to bring a good thing out of the terrible accident. All right? Now, the greatest example is Jesus Christ. And we all know what happened to Jesus Christ. You can thank you, Michael. We all know, you can see it right behind you. But what we sometimes forget is that the death of Christ was a terrible tragedy. They killed Jesus. They tortured Jesus. And it wasn't just any person that got tortured. It was the God-man. The greatest sin ever committed on this planet wasn't the Holocaust, wasn't the Armenian genocide. Those are all terrible. The greatest sin ever committed on this planet was the brutal torture and execution of the God-man. It's the worst thing that was ever done. But you say, how can it be the worst thing ever done? Isn't that our salvation? Yes, that's the point. The point is God, the Father, allowed the worst sin ever to be committed precisely so that he could bring out of it the greatest thing ever, which is our salvation. You see, folks, when we're trying to understand evil and suffering, we need to remember that God doesn't want evil and he doesn't like it. But he can allow it to happen because he knows how to bring good out of it. God didn't kill Jesus. He allowed bad people to kill Jesus because he was able to bring something good out of it, our salvation. Now, a couple quick questions. We still have some time. And I know we'll get through most of this theme tonight. If we need to finish up next time in 5 minutes, could we? I don't know. We'll figure it out. Yeah, we'll figure it out. We want to give you guys good stuff because we want you to be good soldiers of Christ. All right, so the question is, why did Christ suffer at all? Because, see, sometimes people misunderstand it, and they say, you Catholics, you guys are weird because all this pain of Jesus sounds like masochism to me, and they just don't get it, all right? And some Protestants even have this weird, twisted version of our salvation, and here's what they say. God the Father was so angry at human sin that he had to take his anger out on someone, and so he took it out on the innocent lamb. Well, it exists. That's Calvinism. And unfortunately, it's not just Calvinism, it has penetrated into other Protestant evangelical circles. But here's the problem. It's divine child abuse, right? So here's the way that we want to think about it. The true way is that the Father didn't want Jesus to die. He didn't. But he allowed it to happen. There's a big difference between desiring something directly and allowing it to happen. My son's learning how to drive, and I'm watching from the dining room window, and he's coming out the driveway. He's about to hit that garbage can, yeah, right? Because he doesn't see it in his rear view mirror. I could run out, son, stop! You're going to hit it. Or I could just kind of look back, see him run into that garbage can, because I know he's going to learn his lesson. Okay, my point is, I don't want the garbage can hit, but I let it happen. Same thing, right? The Father allowed a terrible thing to happen, but he didn't want it to happen. The other thing that's often misunderstood, and even Mel Gibson misunderstands this. He made a great movie, but if you see interviews, he's basically of the opinion that it's the pain that saves. Every nail was a sin forgiven. It's the pain and all that blood and I think that's twisted, folks. Pain does nothing. It's love that does everything. Love that endures pain does something. Pain that is endured with love does something. But pain in itself has no value. Something that we need to remember. Pain has value only in the context of love. All right. Why did he suffer so much? Why did he have to go through that? If the Incarnation regenerated our nature, why did there have to be so much pain? You're like, well, why couldn't he just live a normal life, get sick a few times, die of old age, or maybe die of some kind of accident, whatever? Why did it have to be so much pain? What was the reason? Why would God allow his son to go through something so unimaginably awful as the crucifixion? Well, St. Thomas in the Summa, this stands for Summa Theologiae, it's written by Thomas Aquinas in his third book, question 4683. You guys can look it up later, but these are the three main reasons he gives, right? And I like to think of these three reasons when I look at the cross because I remember them and it helps me to love Jesus, right? The first one is this. Love is if he had come, our Lord Jesus, and he had come and said, oh yeah, the Father loves you, and he had just lived a normal life and maybe even run away from the garden, whatever, we might not believe that he loves us. We might think, oh, that was just a lot of words. But when you look up there and you consider all that he went through and willingly went through, it's the proof. When a wife really loves her husband, She does things that are hard for his benefit. When a husband loves his wife, same thing. When parents love their children, they work like crazy to provide, put food on the table, right? Pay the bills, they pay their taxes, they do all the headaches. Why? Because they love. And so love is best proven through sacrifice, and Jesus proved that on the cross. The second reason St. Thomas tells us is that it was virtually inevitable. Imagine this, guys, Garden of Gethsemane, right? The night before he died, and he knows that the Romans are coming after him. And what does he do? He books out of there. He runs away. That would make us doubt his love for us. See, virtually inevitable means that he couldn't really escape the pain of the cross without running away. And how did it happen? Because Jesus made people angry by telling them the truth. Jesus got for himself a lot of enemies because he showed people that some of what they were doing was wrong. So this is saying that he just couldn't get away from it. And the third thing is that there is more merit in that which is difficult. So think of it this way. If we had only the Incarnation, then we could have gone to heaven. All the church fathers say this. They say the Incarnation alone was enough to get us to heaven. Okay, well then why the Passion? Because the Passion is giving us more than we needed. The Incarnation alone would have satisfied retributive justice and corrective justice, but the only way that we can get reward is because Jesus did the best possible thing for us. He underwent the most difficult and most meritorious way of saving us. He did way more than he had to do. It'd be like, let's say you owed $100 to the bank, or I don't know, let's make it more. You owed $1,000 on your house, otherwise it's going to foreclose. And so you call your rich uncle and you say, "Hey, Uncle Harry, I'm in a bind. Can you please loan me the 1,000 and I'll pay you back when I can?" Next day you go to your bank account, 50,000 transferred there. Uncle Harry asked for one. Yeah, but he loves you so much that he wanted to give you more than you need. That is Jesus, folks. Loves us so much that the minimum wasn't enough. He had to give us way more than we needed. This you should think of whenever you look at the cross. It should make us so thankful to Jesus that he did more than he had to. Much more than he had to. This image because it's visual. Okay, so let's talk about a cup. All right, let's pretend this is the cup, right? And it's empty and it's closed. This is us before the Incarnation, closed to God's grace. Pretend that the water that goes in is grace. The Incarnation opened the cup. Great, now we can receive God's grace. We can go to heaven. But it's the Passion that converted the cup into a bucket, meaning that we can now fit much more grace. And think of a bucket kind of like Fantasia style, that has its own arms and can scoop water into itself. That's what we are now. We're big buckets that can receive so much grace and even put that grace into ourselves by participating in the cross of Christ every time we offer up our sufferings. You see, we could have just been the open cups, but that wasn't enough for God who loves us. God wanted us to be the big buckets who could scoop some water and put it on in that bucket ourselves. This is the kind of God we have, folks. The God who wants us to have everything. He wants to give us as much as he can and not the minimum that we need. I'm going to leave you one last analogy, and then we'll probably need to end it for today, right? Okay, all right. Just one last analogy, and then Michael and I will talk about what we'll talk, the next topic. But the last analogy is this, okay, because it's helpful. And I like to think about when you were a kid, you probably got allowance. Maybe you as parents give allowance to your kids. Have you ever thought about allowance? I've thought about this when my kid gives me a Christmas gift. And I think, he bought that with my money. But then, hey, I still appreciate it. And you know why I appreciate it? Because my money became his money. And he decided to spend that now his money on me. See, this is what we do, folks. Everything we have is from God. But when we give it back to God, it's like a kid spending his allowance on his parents. Or think of it this way. Think of it this way. The allowance that God gave us in the passion is he allowed us to participate in his suffering. Yep, he suffered on the cross and he allowed us to participate in his suffering. So God on the cross gave us this allowance. Every time we have a suffering and we offer it up willingly, we say, Jesus, I unite myself to you in this pain. We are spending that allowance and giving it back to God. That's what we can all do. All right, Michael, you want to wrap up the class? I know we can talk more later. Yeah.
Yeah, we gonna requesting another 7 minutes. Please, maybe 7 minutes. Okay, because we have a couple of things to do here. So unfortunately, we're out of time, but we will be studying this next week with the Bible. Okay, so again, for those of you who have my Bibles, bring them back and stuff. But I strongly suggest you getting a Bible for next week. A Catholic Bible. Actually, it's a same Catholic Bible because there's different books that the books in everything out. But it has different interpretations and the Protestants one that they do in Catholic Bible. But we're going to say these prayers tonight. And if you want to go ahead and jump ahead, you guys know how to read a Bible. Remember last week was a test. And I just kind of got the questions. So the number one thing was people didn't know how to read the Bible. So we got the Old Testament and the New Testament. We'll show you how to do that next week. We'll do that. But if you want to go ahead and start taking a look at yourself on your own when you get your Bible, of where these Catholic prayers come from. Literally, almost every single thing that we Catholic Church does is either scriptural or traditional. From the Bible or from tradition that Jesus handed down through the apostles, through the culture magisterium. Everything that we do is from Jesus. So the Bible, take a look at that and stuff. Okay? So that's the only we're going to say about that. We're going to start that off next week. We're going to do this first, and then we're going to go on to another teaching that we're going to try. We've got a lot of information to go through in the next couple of weeks, so definitely can bring your notebooks, bring your pens and pencils, take your notes on your phone, and